Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Hello, and welcome to this conversation with Theo and Joe Jack from Bywater Properties.
My name's Theo Michell. I'm one of the founders and now COO of Bywater Properties.
My name's Joe Jack Williams. I'm head of sustainability at Bywater.
Bywater is a UK-based property developer, and we talk about how they are taking a timber-first approach to their development. And in this episode, we talk about what a timber-first approach looks like in terms of how the industry is changing, how timber is becoming more mainstream in the UK, but why they're choosing to really put it at the forefront of the work they're doing in terms of sustainability and reducing carbon emissions, but also things like health and well-being, biophilia, and all the sort of great benefits of using timber in the kind of developments that they're leading. We also talk a lot about a particular case study of one of their projects, which is called Paradise. And it is a six-storey timber-led office building in South London, and all the lessons they kind of learned through that process of being a fairly pioneering building in terms of using the sort of timber-first approach. And we end with some advice for architects and developers on getting started using timber in their own projects. Loads of fascinating insights and takeaways and lessons from this episode, so I really hope you enjoy. Before we jump into the episode, just to let you know, I'll be taking a short break from the podcast after this episode. And I'm not sure when I'll be posting again, but probably the podcast is going to look a little bit different going forward. So I'm just figuring out what that might look like and giving myself a bit of time to kickstart some other interesting projects I'm working on. If you want to stay in touch and up to date, and if you want to be the first to know when there's new episodes and when I'll be able to talk about some of the projects I'm working on, the best thing to do is to get on my newsletter list, my mailing list, and you can do that via the link in the description. Just sort of scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a link to join the newsletter. So for now, enjoy the episode. Let's start by just learning a bit more about Bywater. And I guess this is one for you, Theo. Just tell us a little bit about the history of the company, what you're trying to achieve, and some of the developments you've been involved in.
Yeah, sure. So we've been going since 2006. It was founded by myself and a friend and colleague from Jones Lang LaSalle called Richard Walker. He and I joined on the grad scheme on the same day, became buddies, started chatting about ideas of projects and businesses, and eventually jumped ship about only about 5 years into our careers actually, and that was really helped by Richard's family. So Richard's family business is Iceland Foods. So we started essentially as a family office for the Walker family, and really we've grown now over a number of years from a family office into a multi-family office with a group of high net worth investors, and then through raising a small fund. But really we've been through a quite a significant step change recently, very much on the back of some of the themes I suspect we're going to be talking about today. So our project in Vauxhall, timber office building, brought in Sumitomo Forestry as a joint venture partner for that project, and then subsequently, about a year later, Sumitomo Forestry acquired a 50% stake in Bywater as a business. So we've gone through this evolution really from small beginnings, family office, myself and Richard in a windowless. Actually, our first office was a windowless box and two laptops and a printer, through into a business which is now part owned by Sumitomo Forestry, which is a global player not only in the forestry industry, but in timber-led development all around the world. up until this point, not in either the UK or Europe. So we're now their partner for the UK and indeed Europe. So yeah, we've been through this fabulous journey, but timber and the story around timber and sustainability has really been at the core of this tipping point moment we've been through recently, which is really exciting.
Fascinating. Wow, what a journey. So is this sort of the combo of forestry plus development, does that mean you're really, you're a timber first kind of company at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think timber first is a great way of putting it. I mean, that is a phrase we quite often reach for, really to make a distinction of not timber only. I think we're very, we're acutely aware, and Chojak can speak to this as well, that the choices around material selection are difficult. Clearly, carbon is a critically important part of that, but we have to balance that with other things, not only cost, but fire engineering issues and so on and so forth. So you're absolutely right. We think of ourselves as timber first, really led by a conviction that Sumitomo Forestry absolutely shares, that it's hard to see how we achieve the kind of targets we're setting ourselves as an industry without seriously considering timber as a component of buildings. But even our project in Vauxhall is a hybrid structure. We have elements of steel in that building, where steel is better suited to the purpose. We have concrete, albeit concrete with a lower carbon content, as much as we've been able to achieve in that building, for where concrete is better for its purpose. So timber first, absolutely. The relationship that we have with Sumitomo Forestry and back therefore to the forestry industry is really interesting, and I think it's, in many ways, it's absolutely unique to Sumitomo Forestry as an investor, that they have that cradle to grave view from the forest, from planting saplings, from the kind of genetic engineering activities that, research activities that they do on drought resilience, all the way through to timber supply chain and delivering buildings in timber. That makes them a really extraordinary partner for us, and we're incredibly fortunate to have them on board.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, one of the things that we're acutely aware is that we've got to be pragmatic. We want to be timber first, but we've got to work within the supply chains that already exist. So part of our role is really not just about delivering buildings in timber, it's about educating the supply chain and iterating forward. So actually finding those kind of areas where there's an easier push. So, as Theo mentioned, Paradise in South London, it's got concrete cores. Now, we could have really fought tooth and nail to try and get timber cores, and you can get timber cores, you can build with them, but actually it's really hard work. And actually, maybe for now it's not the case, but that's the next project in the list. So we're slowly building up that capacity as much as we are building up our own capacity. So we like to think we're slightly ahead. We're pushing really hard. We've got to understand, things still need to be profitable. They still need to be buildable. They still need to work. They're still going to make the fire regs and all the other kind of complexities that we have in our industry. And that's really where we are. So we're constantly just trying to be that next step ahead. Push, with a kind of reasonableness. We've got to balance our own risk. And that's where Sumitomo is great. We've got a whole global supply chain behind us. As Theo said, we can see all the way from the forests all the way up to our end product. We're not necessarily using Sumitomo timber. In fact, it's probably quite tricky to use Sumitomo timber in the UK. It's pretty limited supply chain. I think it's mostly the stuff you can get there tends to be sort of lower grade, not really building materials. It tends to be fit out materials. But it's understanding that whole supply chain and realising we're not just kind of isolated. So if we can use a bit of steel and it makes everybody's life a bit easier, okay, fine. But it's using the right material at the right time.
No, that's great. And I'm enjoy having these conversations about the practicalities of delivering the sort of sustainability transition we know is necessary, because there's the principles and concepts, and then there's the reality of actually doing these things on the ground. So appreciate you guys sharing the realities of this.
It's as much about education for everybody. I think it's really easy to sit. I spend loads of time talking to other consultants and designers and built environment professionals, and fantastic. And we all go, yeah, great. Everything should be net zero. And we all agree. But what I'm not doing is talking to, say, subcontractors and sitting down with them saying, well, actually, you know what you're actually building, why it looks like this, and educating that kind of level. That's the important bit, because when we're going out to tender for our buildings, it goes out to a main contractor. The main contractor takes all of our tender docs and splits them all up and divvies them out to the team. And they all come back, and actually we're already very removed. We've already got a really long supply chain before we even think about the product. So anything we can do to educate all of those people in it and get them all on the journey, it makes our life so much easier. So it's great. Podcasts like yourself, your own kind of way of getting this data out and that information out. It's just so important and exciting for us.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I have about 5 questions in my head I want to ask. I'm trying to think what's the most logical one to ask first. Let's talk a little bit, maybe let's ground people in a case study to start. We'll talk a little bit, I think it's Paradise Street in Vauxhall that you mentioned earlier. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that. And then we get into some of these bigger questions around supply chains and influencing the wider industry.
In terms of the history of that building, so yes, that project has become our tipping point project, if you like. It's the first project that we really focused with ambition on using mass timber. That journey started really around 2018. So it was a pre-COVID project. It was actually the old Costa coffee roasting site. It's where the Costa business grew from in South London. So it was a pretty old tin shed, effectively, when we bought it. And really the interesting thing about that project is we found ourselves, and I think this is a useful point to make in terms of the decision making that sits behind pursuing a timber building. We found ourselves with a site in Vauxhall, between Vauxhall and Waterloo. For planning reasons, the site, although it'd be very well suited for residential uses in many ways, that site was constrained to be employment uses. Very difficult to conceive of another industrial use on what is quite a constrained, awkward, essentially a triangular site. So we started thinking about office buildings, and part of the logic for exploring timber really came from this recognition that to deliver an office building in that location, we had to do something really, really exceptional. There are constant innovation in the office sector. It is obviously very location led, and we were clear that we were in a little sub-market there between Vauxhall and Waterloo, where we would need to bring forward something really, really distinctive for it to resonate with the wider occupational market. That then fed into a reflection really for the design team around the fact that we directly border a public park, which is a really unusual situation actually for an office building in London. I mean, I'm sure we can all think about in central London where you have office buildings ringing a public square, a Georgian square, or whatever it might be, but there tends to be a road around that, a railing, a gate. This is a site that actually directly borders not only a park, but a park with really quite mature trees. So the building that stands there now is obviously a timber building where you're looking directly out into, at this time of year as we're speaking, the spring tree canopies just coming into life. It's a kind of extraordinary situation. So that actually was what started us down the track of thinking about timber, and actually it's where the name of the project came from. We're on Old Paradise Street, but it started really as a provocation to the design team. Think about Paradise, think about an office building. How might we conceive of the idea of Paradise in terms of an office building? And actually the themes that we were really focused on was health and well-being in the workplace and mental health, this relationship between the building and the internal environment and the external environment of the park. And the conversation around timber really came from those things, and then clearly we started to understand the carbon implications of pursuing a timber building, which are just so dramatic. And maybe that's the point I'll hand over to Joe Jack. So it was really a 2019, 2020. We got planning for that building during the first lockdown in 2020, but the timber intent locked in really quite early on, but around all those themes of health and well-being, relationship to the park, and then carbon, because of the impact it has on the footprint.
Yeah, I mean, see, sort of hinted at it. One of the things we were working at, thinking about that building from a health and well-being perspective, led us to this kind of timber position. And I should say, I was there working on it in sort of 2019 when I wore my previous hat as head of sustainability at Feeling Like Bradley Studios. So the architects behind it. And we were having these kind of internal discussions, and we were talking away about this beautiful timber frame structure, and we were talking about the connections to the park and the views across. And we started to really think about how we could get more timber into the building from a health and wellbeing. And as we were sort of crunching through it, we started to do a bit of analysis around actually, well, it probably makes it quite a low carbon building. We started to realise that really what we've got is not only an incredibly healthy, happy, relaxing, stress-free environment we're creating, but it's bigger than that. It's not just the building, it's doing that globally in terms of carbon reductions. And we're really starting to think about, this is 2019, this is sort of pre-Letty climate emergency design guide. There's a bit of guidance out there. There's a RICS guidance, UK GBC starting to put the stuff out there. And so we started to really tinker with what does carbon sequestration, in the timber really mean for that building. All of that carbon that's the trees have taken in from the atmosphere, what's the benefit to our site, and start to play around with some of those numbers. And we started to realise pretty quickly, this is early days, we still had far more timber than we've sort of ended up with through various insurance and fire regs reasons, but we were probably, in terms of structure, probably pretty carbon neutral because we had so much timber in the building, which was really exciting for us. And that really started on that kind of timber and carbon journey about what's the benefit of using timber in buildings, not just in the health and well-being, but sort of globally and climatically. And that's really where Bywater really took hold of those figures and started to find that, in central London, looking for a kind of zero carbon building in 2019 and 2020, unless you're Mr. Bloomberg or Mr. Murdoch and you can afford to build your own $1 billion office, you don't really have that opportunity. And it's kind of it's a really open market, I think. There's lots of sustainability claims out there of more or less sort of correctness is how I'll put them. There's lots of buildings saying they're carbon neutral and they 24 stories of fully glazed building, or it doesn't feel carbon neutral, concrete frame or whatever, but it's that kind of thing of is it carbon neutral, and actually having that kind of provocative discussion and openly about what that building means to the London office market. I think that's the exciting thing. Whether we got how you deal with the biogenic carbon that's in the timber, actually that's the discussion I think we all need to have and understand. I think too often it gets bogged down in guidance that's 150 pages long, and it becomes a kind of in the appendix F or whatever. Actually, let's talk about it, let's have that big discussion. We need to make it engaging for as many people as we can because it's so bloody important. It's not just carbon from our project, it's the carbon in the atmosphere for all of us. So really leveraging that and kind of pushing forward is where we ended up. And so Paradise has been a great sort of leveler for that, and off the back of it we've spent a lot of time talking to leasing agents, educating them so they're able to talk to potential tenants who are great. They've just hoovered this stuff up. It's about that education for everybody in that supply chain.
That's great. Does it feel like in the last 5 years, does it feel like the industry has moved on quite a lot in that conversation around carbon and materials?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that and pass back to Joe. Yes is the answer, and off the top of my head, I can think of a number of ways that evidence that. One Joe just alluded to, which is leasing agents, as one example. The leasing agents really play an absolute critical role in the genesis of buildings, and it's often maybe not well enough understood that very early in the process, certainly from our point of view on a building like Old Paradise Street, we inevitably reached out very early to leasing agents before we even acquired the site to get their opinion of the end value. But clearly, it goes beyond their opinion of rent level. It runs into what the spec of the building ought to be for the target market, and they end up having a strong influence on what's delivered to the market. And as Joe said, when we started on this process, timber buildings were close to unheard of, really. Certainly for a spec built office building. Still, Paradise is one of very, very, very few. There's the black and white building in Shoreditch has been finished, which now the London leasing agent community, many of them I suspect have heard of, but it's certainly not a familiar thing at all. So very, very much, we've used this project, as Joe Jack said, as a way of educating and bringing that community with us on the journey and creating allies out of them, giving them narratives, really. I mean, a lot of their role is clearly articulating a story and selling a story. They need those talking points, that narrative, that basic understanding to be able to articulate forward. So that has very definitely changed. The other aspects that have very definitely changed that have been relevant, I would say, are planning. So back in 2018, 2019, finishing out in 2020, when we were at the early design stages of this building and in conversation with Lambeth Council, timber, I think, at the time was, they were certainly interested. It certainly was sort of intriguing, but it was not by any means a kind of significant topic of conversation in terms of the planning discourse that we went through. It felt as though it was of passing interest and not a great deal more than that. So that environment has very definitely changed. The insurance environment has very definitely changed. We might come back to talk about that, but through the lifetime that we've been working on this project, the insurance world has definitely become more amenable to timber, to the point where when we started on our project, we quite often had people make sort of throwaway comments along the lines of, "You do realise your building is uninsurable," which caused a few sleepless nights. Through really a direction of travel, that uninsurable has become, well, very expensive to insure, and multiple insurers to, well, quite expensive to insure, and it's tapered down, so that has changed significantly. So, yeah, there have been a whole series of changes, I think, over that 5-year period, where I think we have found ourselves from a point where we were one of very few pioneers, and we might talk about how we found ourselves in that position, through to a situation today where there are a number of timber and timber hybrid buildings certainly being discussed, being talked about. We feel we're now at the forefront of a small but growing movement, which is a really exciting place to be.
Exactly that. I think Theo's point about this quick evolution of knowledge within the industry. Theo talked about timber, and actually the timber learning curve that we've gone through with the industry and other industry groups. We're going along parallel, and in many cases trying to push that along and force it forward, where they've been slightly more reluctant. I won't mention any groups, but some of them may be more accepting than others. But what I would say is there's so much more information out there in terms of sustainable buildings. 6 years ago it was BREEAM. Maybe we talk about WELL if you're interested in that kind of side to it, but now we have things like LETI targets. They came out in 2020, and we have iterations of LETI targets. We've got more from the UK GBC in terms of guidance. We've got the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which is came out in pilot study end of last year and is kicking off this year. really exciting. So we have these great levelers to enable those discussions. And again, it's about having that even discussion where we all have the same language. So when I say net zero carbon and somebody else says net zero carbon, we know we're on the same page. If I say it's low energy, I know it's low energy because it aligns to LETI approach to energy, or that kind of side to it. And actually, once you have that common language, that's a big way of unlocking that progress. You can spend hours just trying to debate whether you're talking the same language in terms of sustainability. A lot of that's gone by the side. There's still, there's next frontiers, biodiversity, or it's about health and well-being, it's social, it's all those other kind of bits of sustainability, which are perhaps less nailed down, but they're more complex in some ways. We've had years of trying to understand how carbon works. We need to do the same for all those other kind of slightly more complicated bits. So we'll get there. It's always a constant progress, always a constant iteration, and looking for those next questions.
Yeah, I think certainly from our point of view, having some clear targets and distilling down, as Jojak said, a really huge area of debate around carbon and so on, down into something relatively simple, in terms of an understanding of whole life and embodied and operational energy, and a target to aim for what good looks like has been really positive. And I think my experience has been that taking through not only Paradise but now the other projects, Paradise for us is one of 6 live projects, all using timber. Now all of those projects we're using, I think, really positively, a kind of clear day one understanding of what we think is a realistic stretch target to hit in terms of embodied carbon and how we might go about it. That's a hugely positive motivator for a design team, and really gives us something clear to focus on, which is, again, I think, back to your question around how things changed over the few years that we've been working on this, I certainly personally feel a lot more clarity around that today than we did 5 years ago, where we had a slightly fluffy understanding of what a good building in terms of carbon might look like, and it's we've moved on a long way from that.
That's excellent. I mean, it's great to hear, and I think one of the things I try and remind people through the podcast is that often change within the industry, within society, happens in a very non-linear fashion. So it isn't necessary that we're making steady progress year over year over decades. It feels like nothing happens for decades, and then all of a sudden a lot changes very quickly. Is more often how things go.
I completely agree with that, and I think from our point of view, my personal point of view with this project, if we've ended up being one of those demonstrator projects and having the courage of our convictions to push ahead with a timber project where others have perhaps sat on the fence or found it difficult to move forwards, we've been part of one of those step changes that suddenly moves forward and suddenly shows that, well, actually you can achieve a new build at these kind of carbon levels, then that's an enormous accolade as far as we're concerned. We're delighted to have done that. The only other thing to add perhaps on this, which I think is really interesting in relation to this target setting and the sense in which the industry is moving forwards. Everybody loves a target and everyone likes to win and have the best and compete against a number. But I certainly feel that there's much more kind of collaboration and open book around this particular issue than there is perhaps in other targets and other kind of commercial spheres. I mean, this really does feel like an issue where we're sharing best practice with other developers. We're sharing. We're going to site visits of other timber hybrid schemes. There's a real sense, to my mind, that this has become a kind of galvanizing issue for some industry change and some really supportive, as I say, kind of collaboration between people who otherwise might be competitors. And I think that's something really powerful to harness as well. And again, it's great to be part of that group that all feels like we're pulling in the same direction to unlock some of these problems, like insurance, for example, which actually those issues are resolved by having more projects coming forwards. The last thing we want to be is the only timber building in London that actually causes us a headache. It's great if others bring forward timber hybrids. We need within our industry an opportunity for experimentation and to drive forwards and work out what is the best approach to still build, still invest, but do so in a carbon responsible way.
It's exactly that collaboration that smooths out those lumps and bumps you talk about, Ross. Actually, one of the reasons we have so many lumps and bumps in the industry in terms of movement forwards or even backwards in rare cases is because we wait for project cycles to finish, and projects take 3 to 5 years off, and you wait for it to be approved as a case study, and then it goes forward, and it's the next iteration. Whereas actually what we need to be doing as an industry is sharing and collaborating, exactly as Theo's saying, so there's far more of a smooth transition between these lumps and bumps. Years ago, I used to do a lot more operational energy stuff, particularly post-occupancy evaluation. And what you start to realise very quickly is if you wait to find out the performance of your project when it's finished, and you have to wait a couple of years once it's finished to settle down and seasonal commissioning and understand how it's going to perform, you can quickly have 5 years. And if you want to get to a net 2050 zero carbon goal or whatever that might well be, that's not a lot of projects, and that's not a lot of time to iterate. Whereas if you can start to have that sharing with across industry, where it's even just within your own portfolio, if you've got a portfolio of projects. I'm thinking about when I used to be an architectural practice, we used to have 30 projects. It was difficult enough to share the lessons there. But if you can start to smooth that out and share that knowledge across, you can really start to improve things far quicker. You can learn from each other and share those learnings so you don't make the same mistakes, or you make those benefits, you take those benefits forward. And that's exactly what we're trying to do at Paradise. It's taking some of our learnings and some of the key things, the messaging we've got, the education we've put in our supply chain, and when that whole supply chain, whether it's from the fire brigade and the insurers all the way down to the subbies on site, they're all learning. Hopefully they take all that knowledge to the next projects, and that's the essential thing. Otherwise, we're never going to reach our 2050 net zero target. It's going to be really difficult. There's not a lot of projects between now and 2050.
So well put. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that we'll chat some more about, I think, the wider industry. I'd be interested to just finish the conversation on Paradise Street. Can you just tell us, is it completed now and occupied, or what stage is it at?
Yeah, so we're just coming up to completion in the next few weeks. So we have a launch event in early May after the Easter break, but the project is essentially close to finished. I'm conscious the one thing we've not talked about so far, although we've alluded to it lots, is the carbon outcome on that project. So Joe Jack, I don't know if you want to talk to that one.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. No, we sort of alluded to it. Yeah, so we think the building will be around 415 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared for upfront carbon, which I think puts it squarely in the kind of realms of UK net zero carbon building standard, that kind of region for a new build, which is amazing for a building that was thought about 6 years ago. But the other bigger thing is it locks away about 1,800 tons of CO2 just in the timber, which is huge. As a rough ready reckoner, that's probably the carbon for, I think it's about 24, 25 new homes, individual homes just being built, just locked away in that building. And I think for me, what's really important about that is, forestry takes up a lot of our land space, globally, whatever that might well be. We need to make sure it's productive and used properly, and actually just taking that carbon storage that's in the timber and then locking it away in our building means that we can use that site for more forestry, more carbon reduction, but also locking it away in a building like Paradise means that it's really safe. We sort of hinted at the amount of work we've done with fire engineers, but actually, it's got smoke detectors. It probably have fire wardens in it. It's going to have, all of the kind of good stuff that means it's nice and safe and secure. So, from a Paradise point of view, it's an actively helping us kind of draw down carbon and lock it away and be safe. So that that's the key thing, for one of the key reasons for using timber, as well as it's just inherently lower carbon than steel and concrete. It's an actively, it's a solution.
And I guess just to add on that, just as context, so as Joe mentioned, we're coming out at around about 415 kilos in terms of built. A kind of standard benchmark for a conventional build is probably somewhere around 1,000, maybe just shy of 1,000. So we're coming in at roughly 40%, let's say 40, just over 40% of the footprint of a conventional build. Again, just wrapping back to something we mentioned earlier, at the initial design stage, the Paradise building actually had a timber core, as I think Joe mentioned in passing. So it would have been considerably better than that originally. But one of the things we've learned through this process is the interpretation of the building regs, isn't black and white. There's some give and take around that. We were very clear that we were complying with building regs with that timber core at the initial stages of the design. But when we had consultation with London Fire Brigade, I think their phrase was, "It's just one of innovation too many," was the phrase that stuck in my mind. So it's there's a series of give or take, but I think what I'm really heartened by is, if having made those give and take adjustments, if having pivoted away from the design intent of a timber core and ended up with a concrete core to keep the London Fire Brigade comfortable and insurers comfortable, if introducing steel into that structure, particularly to help pass through M&E systems and so on, if after all of that you're still able to deliver a building at 40% of conventional and hit the kind of levels we've achieved, that I think is really remarkable. It's really encouraging. It certainly means for us that we've got greater confidence that as we go forward into the next cycle of projects, and maybe we get an opportunity to revisit those discussions around timber cores, or maybe we find a way of taking a bit more carbon out of the concrete where we do need to use concrete, that there is there's a real prospect of driving those numbers slowly lower, which has to be our shared ambition. So it's been a fantastic process, demonstrator, not only for us but hopefully for the wider industry of what you can do. Coming back to where we started, the numbers that we're hitting, at the end of the day, it's all about the use of timber. Had we not been using timber, had we been using recycled steel components where we're able to low carbon concrete and so on, we still wouldn't have hit anything like those numbers, is our feeling. Particularly the use of CLT floor slabs and all that volume of carbon intensive material that's taken out of the build. That's the really significant move, which comes back to this relationship we have with Sumitomo Forestry. As Joe Jack said, it's not to do with importing Japanese timber or deploying their forestry. It's back to just a much simpler conviction that timber and timber-led buildings has to be a core part of the way that we meet our carbon ambitions.
Well, you're spurring more questions in my mind now, so I'll keep going on this for the moment, which is it all British timber, or where is it sourced? And what are the supply chains like now in terms of getting access to good timber for this?
So, I mean, most of it's Austrian. I mean, that's where it comes from. So I think it's Storo Enzo for the CLT panels, and is it Hasselacker for the glulam beams and columns. I mean, we don't make an awful lot of mass timber in the UK. There's a couple of factories. There's one in Scotland. I think there's one in Wales. Very limited supply chains. That they're in kind of demonstrated period. It's one of those things. We don't have a lot of timber in the UK that's repurposed for this kind of site. So finding those kind of supply chains That's the key bit, and make sure they exist. Europe has efficient factories, efficient deliveries from sites. They understand how things are going to move around, and those kind of ins and outs of it. In some ways, for us to learn it, great, but we're leveraging that kind of existing expertise, and I think that's the key bit. What I would say is it would be exactly the same if we're looking for steel. If we're looking for a steel beam, where's the steel from? Probably Brazil or somewhere in China. That's the ore. Where's it going to come from? So once you start to look in supply chains, particularly metals, very difficult. Timber tends to be a lot easier. We all have FSC or PEFC certified with a chain of custody, so we can see, okay, it's come from this forest, it's gone to that factory, it's turned into that bit of mass timber, and it comes to our site. It's actually it's a pretty good way to do it.
It's probably just worth adding, just for clarity, that transport from Austria to the UK, the carbon implications of that are all factored into the carbon calculation of the material, and therefore the end building. I think it's also interesting, maybe just to reflect on we for very good reasons, we think a lot about local supply chains, and as Joe Jack said, there's the beginnings of a mass timber industry in the UK, very early stage, very low volumes. Let's see where that gets to. But in many ways, the issue that we face is global. I think there is a legitimate kind of question around, does it really matter where the trees are growing, so long as they are growing, and when they're harvested, that material is locked away. As Joe said, it's a really interesting point. Think about that building as a carbon store more than as an office building. The sprinkler systems, the facade systems are there to make it a safe, functional building, but it also makes it a very safe kind of repository for carbon, if you like. That's it's a really interesting kind of slight pivot on the way we think about buildings and timber buildings. But where the timber grows, where it's sequestering carbon out of the environment, arguably, is less important. Perhaps, we could debate that. The other thing I think that's interesting, and this again is one of the things it's really fantastic for us being part of the wider Sumitomo Forestry family. They do a lot of development, again, timber-led, in the United States. And I was talking recently to I guess kind of colleagues now of ours in the US about where we source our timber from, and talking about the fact that our timber is coming from Austria, and they made the observation that, well, for them, that distance is sort of driving from one side of the state to the other side of the state, and that somehow feels just intuitively feels reasonable and sustainable, whereas ideally the fact that we're bringing our timber from Austria feels like, well, I wish there was a slightly more local alternative. But actually, if you look at the big picture, it's a really sensible thing to do, and the carbon implications of the transport, be great if that came lower over time. I'm absolutely confident that the supply chain are working on that, but nonetheless, it still makes absolute logical sense.
It's so sensitive to how you transport stuff. So, as an example, we did some analysis for my book, and it was about what would it take to emit, I think it's 100 kilograms of CO2 to transport a ton of material. So if you're in Southampton, if you transport a ton of material from, I think it's sort of Dundee, Aberdeen way, up in Scotland, on a lorry, that'll emit about 100 kilos of CO2 from Aberdeen, Dundee way down to Southampton. You could get the same amount of material all the way from Baltimore in the States on a cargo ship. So although it's a long distance, actually, it's the method of transport is just as important. It's the same, if I managed to put it on a freight train, that same amount of carbon would be emitted if I took a train from Ankara with my ton of material. So it's not necessarily intuitive, and it's really sensitive to how it works. So when Theo's point about driving across the state in America, American trucks are nowhere near as efficient as European trucks, and actually in some ways I'd much rather trust shipping it from New Zealand on the back of a cargo ship than I would on the back of a lorry across America. So again, it's that understanding localism. What are you dealing with localism? And I think probably the bigger thing with localism is about, it's job creation and resilience and community as it is about, carbon emissions.
That's super interesting. Thanks for that. Okay, what was my what was my next question? What was the so I've before this episode comes out, I'll have released an episode with Salim Consul, who is one of the people who worked on the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. So we sort of had a discussion on that, and I think that would be an interesting one for people to pair with this conversation. One of the things that came up in that conversation was that in the calculation for the standard, you don't include the carbon sequestration from timber. So can you talk a little bit around that, about if your, timber still makes sense, obviously, as a low carbon material, and then are you looking at things like offsetting elsewhere to get to the net zero standard, or how does that work, in a practical sense?
Sure. Shall I? Okay, on. So the reason within the net zero carbon building standard we separate it out is because one thing we want to be clear about is that carbon emissions now are the big problem. So what we're always doing is we're always reporting what's emitted now and what's sequestered separately. And there's a really good point here about where you treat that sequestered carbon and how you factor that into the overall conversation and that overall calculation as well. But what I would say is the net zero carbon building standard is taking a pragmatic approach, and that's why we have that separation. For us, where we have that 1,800 tons of CO2 that's locked away in the frame, that's it's important. I think it's really essential. But we follow the kind of approach within the net zero carbon building standard to say that that's not included in our calculation. That sits there as a nice to have. There's a bigger discussion, particularly the EU changed its regulations recently that says that if carbon's locked away for more than 35 years, it can actually be treated as a carbon offset. That's something we probably need to have a think about, particularly as we get more buildings going forward. But we'll be offsetting in parallel anyway. So through a kind of approved system, whether it's the gold standard or one of the other ones, the problem with offsetting is it's difficult to do that due diligence to a level that's makes us feel comfortable. There are great standards out there. We're looking at different sort of timber and forestry aspects. That's currently our kind of exploration. But yeah, so our in terms of our calculations, to be clear, we've got our carbon emissions, that's our upfront. We've got a carbon sequestration that sits separately, and that's for us, and that makes us feel, it's happy. It's good. We know our building's doing good things. What we don't have is a system to kind of deal with that, and it gets even worse if we start to look at whole life carbon or life cycle embodied carbon. So currently the RICS guidance has we call it the -1+1 approach. So in our A1 to A3 modules, we take account of all that carbon sequestration. So the only time we can use carbon sequestration is when we look at life cycle embodied carbon. We take that minus approach, so that lump at the start, which is the kind of negative lump in A1 to A3. Unfortunately, the way it has to be dealt with now is in module C3 at the end of life of that building. That exact same amount of carbon is emitted. So there is net zero benefit for anybody to include it in the calculation. Now, I really don't agree with it. I think it's not quite the right way at all. I think it's reductionist, and it's a kind of carbon accounting sort of approach. What I think is more important to understand is that the carbon we emit in future is far more speculative, it's far more unknown, and therefore has it got the same risk, has it got the same value? I don't think it does. If you look at something like the French, they have a RE 2020 approach as a kind of discounting method, which I think is something we should probably look at in the UK, and there's loads of other ways of kind of calculating that. But the other thing is, if you look at our net zero carbon pathway for the UK, a really important bit is biomass energy carbon capture and storage. Now, regardless of whether you agree with burning crops and to generate energy, the carbon capture bit is going to be an important part of our process. So, or out of that chimney, all of that carbon from the materials is then captured, stored somewhere underground, probably maybe in an old oil well. If we think that's going to happen, then that's exactly what we'd imagine would happen with our timber frame building at the end of its life. It's not how we've designed it. Our frame's designed to be dismountable and reusable. But in terms of carbon calculation, that's what we have to assume. So if we think that carbon capture and storage are going to happen in 60 years' time, and we have to, otherwise we don't have a net zero carbon pathway that works, then we should assume that there won't be any carbon emissions at all for end of life of our building. So yeah, we have a kind of funny dichotomy where we, on one hand, we say we have a net zero carbon pathway, but actually when we do the calculation, we say we don't. And in some ways, that's that kind of problem, is either we believe that net zero carbon pathway and we all buy into it, we all work towards it, or we don't. And I think if we don't, then we've got far bigger problems than what I do with my carbon sequestration in module C3. We've got huge issues not that far away at all. So yeah, it's an interesting problem in terms of carbon modelling and sequestration.
I mean, I think Joe's probably just beautifully illustrated there the degree to which this conversation gets very technical very fast. And for me, whenever we talk about these things, you almost feel instinctively that you want to separate that technical discussion from a more emotive discussion. Yes, there needs to be a forensic way of thinking and accounting for carbon, and working through the life cycle of a project, what happens at end of life, so on and so forth. But at the point where that starts undermining, if you like, that kind of sense of like, well, therefore I'm no longer confident that it's the right thing to do to build in timber because I can't count the fact that the structure is locking away carbon because, for the more technical reasons, that just feels difficult to understand and to live with. So I think the two things sit in parallel. A real sort of technical debate, but also not losing sight of that kind of core, more emotive sense that there are materials. And this conversation, for obvious reasons, we've focused very much on timber, but I'd probably widen that out to all bio-based materials. There are a group of materials out there that we probably ought to be using more than carbon intensive alternatives. How we account for that and getting the kind of technical accounting of that right between different jurisdictions and so on, that will come, but it's difficult to undermine that kind of core belief, if you like, that has got to be the right way to go. So yeah, it's getting the balance right is challenging, and working within an environment where a regulatory framework, a carbon accounting framework, common standards are still bedding in is difficult. But I strongly feel that shouldn't discourage anybody from pursuing particularly timber, but all bio-based approaches for delivering projects going forwards.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think there's a holistic perspective on sustainability, of which the carbon accounting aspect is one element, and I think there's also a wider placemaking aspect of being that we just want to create. You've spoken a lot about the multiple benefits of building with timber around biophilia and health and well-being that are just further reinforcing why you would use this, not only for a carbon accounting perspective. So yeah, very, very well put. I think just as we're getting on to the last sort of 10 minutes, can you sort of think of what you would advise other developers and design teams who are maybe approaching timber construction for the first time? What sort of lessons and wisdom can you share with them to sort of advise them to do this well? To
be honest, wrapping back to a question you asked earlier about what's changed over the last 5 years, that's a good jumping off point for this, because I do feel that increasingly, as we've done more and more work in this space, I say the Paradise building we've talked about a lot, but that's now one among a number of projects for us. Over that period of time, we've certainly become aware of what I increasingly think of in my mind as the timber gang. There is a core expertise in the UK that is really growing, and has a depth of experience with timber that's growing. And I'm thinking of architects and structural engineers and fire engineers in particular. But that timber gang is steadily growing. But there is very definitely a kind of core identifiable group of names that consistently keeps coming up over and over again of people who've really got experience. So in terms of lessons, I think the first one would be find your way into the timber gang. A really good bit of advice that we received early on is thinking about Paradise as an example, don't just design an office building and then at some point during stage 3 decide, oh, what about we do this in timber? Let's just change it to a timber building. You need to think through using timber really early on, and not make a pivot down the line. I guess the other thing that I would single out, and then I'll pass over to Joe Jack, is this ongoing conversation around insurers and the importance of bringing insurers with you on a journey. Again, we were very well advised in that regard as far as Old Paradise Street goes, and we had insurers in the room really from stage 2, intensively from stage 3 onwards, as it became apparent on that project that we were going to need to do a full-scale fire test, for example. We had the insurers and the insurance underwriters, not just the brokers, but the underwriters in the room with the design team, reviewing the test rig to make sure that they were comfortable, they were going to accept and felt ownership and participation of that fire test result when it was done. So yeah, reach out really early, take them with you on the journey, explain the design logic around individual decisions. That's a consistent piece of advice that comes up over and over again.
I think yeah, just to add on to those key points, start with timber, don't start with a concrete frame building and try and backwards work it. That doesn't necessarily stack up. You can, but it's going to be far too complex, and you're going to come up with all these kind of problems. But that second point Theo made about collaboration and getting in the early stages, there's so much information out there at the minute about how to build in timber. If you look at the new model building, look at TD UK, Built by Nature, Wood Knowledge Wales. There are organisations who are desperate for us to build more in timber. And they have loads of fantastic, detailed information. And it's about educating your design team, making sure your design team get on board with it, think about the ins and outs, but also start to think about the contractors, think about how the contractor is going to build it and the benefits they're going to have. And then when you start to think about that, actually start to think about those kind of costs. So realise actually where those costs are. Timber tends to be a little bit more expensive as a product, but you can make those savings back if it's designed well and it's quick to build. Actually getting it on site, and you can have clean building sites, quick to construct, quiet. There's all these kind of benefits that come from it. So again, just engage with the whole supply chain, and don't forget about the industry bodies, and don't forget about the subcontractors. They all have an amazing part to play in it. If your subcontractors and people on site building it keep the timber dry, you've got a great building for 60, 100 years. All of those kind of things are just amazing. So that's it. Collaboration. It's always bloody collaboration. We just don't do enough of it.
Yeah, I think it's worth again looping back to this point about targets as well. Something that we're doing now, which I would definitely advocate others do. Not just think about timber building, but any building, to be frank, is think about a clear design brief for the team and get them on board early with some clear targets in terms of what the client ambition is around timber, embodied carbon, operational energy, and so on and so forth. That is something now that we're doing routinely. The approach generally is to start off looking at that the typology of projects. So we've been speaking a lot about Paradise, which is a ground up build. Actually, a lot of what we're working on at the moment, the majority certainly in the workspace sector, are cut and carve refurbishments of existing structures. Lots of benefit, obviously, in terms of the carbon story there, retaining a structure and adding to it, and where you add to it, in our case, always from that timber first position. But those sorts of retrofit with timber on top, we're beginning to get a really good handle of where those projects ought to be outturning in terms of embodied carbon footprint. So we're setting those targets, and then we're just continually just slightly moving the needle. Last time we achieved this time let's aim for the same again, less 5% or whatever it might be, and just challenging design teams to continually try and nudge that agenda forwards.
That's great, guys. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today and just sharing so much of your knowledge and experience. I think the Timber Plus retrofit would be another great podcast to do in the future. So let's stay in touch on that. Where can people find out more about you? Where would you like to sort of point people towards?
I guess our main website is very easy, bywaterproperties.com. You'll find your way through to either myself or Joe Jack there and the rest of the team and see what else we're working on.
Yeah, and LinkedIn, we're pretty active on LinkedIn, so you always got what's happening with it. We're sharing pictures of the projects as they're coming up, and little bits for some of our project team, the wider project team. So yeah, keep an eye on LinkedIn too. I think it's a good start point. Great. Links to all that will be in the episode description, so people can go on and check out your work. But yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much. Excellent. Thanks very much, Ross.
No problem.
Thanks.
Absolute pleasure.